The stars had always seemed so far away, distant and cold. But now, they had arrived. A ship, unlike anything humanity had ever seen, appeared in the skies above Earth. Its shape was sleek and sharp, as if forged from the darkness itself. The news channels were ablaze with reports of the strange vessel, and fear spread like wildfire across the planet. What was it? Who were they? And most importantly, were they here to conquer? The truth, however, was far less dramatic than what the world had imagined. The ship wasn't a weapon of mass destruction. It wasn't an army waiting to strike. It was just one ship, carrying one passenger, a lone alien woman named Lyra. When she first stepped out of the ship, the cameras focused on her with sharp intensity. Standing tall, her features were both otherworldly and somehow familiar. Her skin was a soft shade of pale blue, a color that looked almost translucent under the sunlight. Her eyes, large and bright, had a haunting depth, as if they held the secrets of galaxies. Her ears, small and elf-like, peeked through her silvery hair that cascaded down her back like liquid light. To the human eye, she looked like a creature from a nightmare. A monster. The world gasped. News outlets scrambled to get close-up shots of her as she stepped onto Earth's soil, her movements graceful and calculated. The camera flashes went off like a storm, blinding her with light. The sound of shouting reporters filled the air, each one desperate to get an answer. But Lyra stayed silent. She didn't flinch, she didn't flail. She simply stood there waiting. It wasn't the first time Earth had encountered aliens, but it was certainly the first time they were meeting one of their own kind in such a vulnerable manner. In the past, the world had learned to fear aliens, who had come with their weapons and power. Now this lone figure stood before them, seemingly vulnerable but no less frightening. "Who are you? What do you want?" a reporter called out, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and curiosity. The question echoed in the air, but there was no immediate answer. The world waited, holding its breath. Lyra had been prepared for this moment, but the weight of the human gaze was still heavy. She had heard about Earth from the stories of her people. They spoke of the strange, stubborn humans, a species that had the potential for great good but also terrible destruction. She didn't know what to expect, but she had hoped, in the quiet moments of the long journey, that maybe Earth's people would see beyond her appearance. But the first signs were not promising. Lyra's feet shuffled slightly, the only sign of her discomfort. She was not used to being the center of attention, not in this way. She had come with peace in her heart, hoping to form a connection with Earth's inhabitants. But already she could feel the chill of fear in the air. Suddenly, from behind the walls of barricades and security officers, a voice rang out, sharp and angry. "Get back. This isn't some kind of circus act." A man in a dark suit shouted, shaking his fist. The crowd murmured in agreement, a ripple of hostility passing through them. Lyra's gaze flickered toward him, and for the first time she spoke. Her voice was soft, carrying an echo of something ancient and wise. "I am not here to harm anyone. I only wish to speak." Her words were a plea, though her tone was calm and composed. She wasn't here to force her presence on Earth, but the world was already filled with accusations. There was no room for diplomacy when people were too terrified to hear her words. The human race had always struggled with fear of the unknown. Lyra knew that well. Her people, though peaceful, were often misunderstood by other species. She had heard the stories, the whispered fears about her kind, their strength, their abilities, their strange and beautiful appearance. To many, they were a mystery wrapped in fear, an enigma to be destroyed or controlled. And that was exactly what humanity did in response. The media twisted her words, painted her as a threat before she even had a chance to explain. The world was filled with headlines like "Alien Monster on Earth" and "Terror from the Stars." Lyra was not a monster, but the more people saw her, the more the fear grew. She was different, and difference often equaled danger. As the stories swirled around her, the people of Earth couldn't see her as she truly was. To them, she was just another monster from the stars. The human governments quickly set up barriers and security forces around her, treating her like an animal in a cage. But Lyra never fought back. She never screamed or fought against the chains of misunderstanding. She remained silent, her only crime being her appearance, her very existence. But amidst the chaos, one thing remained, a small flicker of hope. Somewhere in the world, there had to be someone who would see beyond the surface, someone who would look past the fear and the labels and see her as she truly was. As the world raged with fear and hatred, Lyra stood alone, waiting. The only thing she could do now was wait for a person, a human, who could look beyond the monster they thought she was. And somewhere, deep in the heart of Earth, a quiet voice began to stir. Days passed, and still, the world struggled to understand. The alien woman, Lyra, who had come in peace, was now confined to a secure facility on Earth. The walls of the building were tall and thick, meant to keep the world out, but they also kept Lyra inside. She was isolated, a prisoner of fear, even though she had done nothing to harm anyone. Lyra had come to Earth with the hope of forming a connection with humanity. She had traveled across the stars, a journey that took years, driven by the belief that peaceful coexistence could be achieved between her people and the humans of Earth. She wanted to understand their culture, their hearts, and to share the knowledge of her own kind. But the human race had not received her with open arms. Instead, they had feared her. They had seen her as a monster. Inside the facility, Lyra's days were spent in silence. Guards watched her every move, their eyes filled with suspicion. No one spoke to her directly, except for a few occasional remarks from the soldiers who were assigned to her. The people who once crowded around her, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward, were now gone. All she had was her own thoughts, the soft hum of the facility's lights and the occasional whisper of the wind outside the thick walls. Lyra missed the stars. She had longed to see them, to breathe in the endless sky of her home planet once more. But here on Earth, she was trapped in a cage of misunderstanding. She often sat by the small window in her room, staring out at the city below. It was a world, so different from her own, so vibrant and yet filled with confusion and fear. People had painted her as a creature from their worst nightmares, a threat to their way of life. In their eyes, she was nothing more than a dangerous being that had come to destroy everything they held dear. But Lyra knew she was not dangerous. She had no weapons, no powers that would harm them. She only wished to learn, to connect, to share what her people had learned over centuries of peace. Yet her desire for peace seemed lost in the noise of fear. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps outside her door. She knew who it was before the door opened. A guard, tall and stern, stepped inside, his face as emotionless as the walls around them. "Lunch," the guard said briefly, holding out a tray of food. It was simple: bread, some sort of green vegetable, and a cup of water. No one had bothered to ask her what she might prefer. No one cared about her needs or wishes. To them, she was just an alien, an unknown entity to be kept at arm's length. Lyra nodded, accepting the tray without a word. She sat down at the small table by the window, looking out at the busy world below. The food didn't matter to her, not in the grand scheme of things. She had tasted far better meals in the past, and yet, what she craved now was something more, something real. She wanted human connection, understanding, and perhaps most of all, she wanted a friend. But now that seemed impossible. She took a slow bite of the bread, her eyes lingering on the people walking on the streets below. They didn't know her. They didn't know what her people were like, or what she was capable of. All they knew was the fear that had been drilled into their minds by the media, by the government, by anyone who had a reason to keep them afraid. As the days turned into weeks, Lyra found herself growing more and more frustrated. She knew she had to find a way to break through the walls of fear that surrounded her. But how? How could she make them see her for who she really was when all they saw was a monster? She wasn't sure, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't stay in this isolation forever. One morning, something unexpected happened. The door to her room opened, but it wasn't a guard who stepped in. It was a human, a man. His name was Daniel, and he had come to speak to her. At first, Lyra thought it was a mistake. She had seen so many humans come and go, each one more frightened of her than the last. But Daniel didn't seem afraid. He wasn't trembling or glaring at her with distrust. He just walked in quietly, his eyes meeting hers with an expression of curiosity, not fear. "Hello," Daniel said gently, his voice calm and unthreatening. Lyra didn't respond immediately. She wasn't sure what to make of him. Could this human truly be different? Or was he simply another face, another person who would eventually see her as a threat? But Daniel didn't look at her as if she were a monster. He didn't flinch when he looked at her, and he didn't try to speak to her as though she were an animal. He simply sat down across from her, keeping a respectful distance. "I've been reading about your people," Daniel continued, "and I think there's been a mistake. I don't think you're here to hurt us." His words were simple, but they held weight. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone was speaking to her without fear, without hatred. Someone was acknowledging her presence as a fellow being, not as a monster. Lyra felt a small spark of hope, a tiny flicker that maybe, just maybe, not all humans were as quick to judge as the rest. "I'm sorry," Daniel said after a pause. "I didn't mean to disturb you, but I think we need to talk." And in that moment, something shifted in Lyra. Maybe the world hadn't completely turned against her. Maybe there was still a chance for connection, for understanding, and for peace. She took a deep breath, finally feeling like there might be someone she could talk to. Perhaps Daniel would be the one to show the world that she was more than they thought. "I would like that," she whispered softly, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of silence. Daniel sat across from Lyra, unsure of how to begin. He had spent days preparing for this meeting, reading everything he could about the alien woman who had been labeled a monster by the world. But now that he was finally here, face to face with her, words seemed hard to find. Lyra sat quietly, her pale blue skin glowing faintly in the dim light of the room. Her large, curious eyes watched Daniel, but her expression remained unreadable. There was a silence between them that neither seemed ready to break. "Do you understand why they call you a monster?" Daniel asked softly, breaking the stillness. Lyra looked down at her hands clasped together in her lap. "I understand," she whispered. "I look different. My people look different. To them, different means dangerous." Daniel nodded slowly. He had heard the same arguments before, but hearing them from Lyra gave him a new perspective. He had spent his life trying to understand how fear could shape people's actions, and now here it was, playing out in front of him. "I don't think you're dangerous," Daniel said, his voice firm but kind. I think the fear comes from not knowing, from not understanding." Lyra's eyes met his, and for the first time since their meeting, she saw something in his expression, something warm and genuine. She couldn't explain it, but there was something in the way Daniel spoke that made her feel safe. It was a feeling she had almost forgotten in this cold, isolated room. "You're different," she said quietly, "and yet you don't fear me." Daniel smiled slightly, leaning forward in his chair. "I've spent my life studying diplomacy, learning to understand people, no matter how different they may seem. That's why I came here, to understand." Lyra was silent for a moment, absorbing his words. "And what have you learned so far?" "I've learned that everyone has a story, and sometimes that story gets lost in all the noise, the fear, the judgment, the anger. I'm not here to judge you, Lyra. I'm here because I want to hear your story. I want to understand your people, not just the image the world has created." Lyra's heart stirred with a feeling she hadn't felt in so long. Hope. Hope that someone, at least one human, was willing to look beyond the surface, beyond the fear, and truly listen. It was a small spark, but it was enough to make her feel like maybe she wasn't as alone as she thought. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice soft and steady. "My people are not like what the world believes. We do not seek war, nor do we take what is not ours. We come from a place far away, a world that is dying. We traveled here seeking refuge, hoping to find peace. Daniel listened intently, his expression serious. So you came here for safety? Lyra nodded. Yes, our home, our planet, it was once beautiful. We were a peaceful race, united by knowledge and compassion. But as time passed, our planet's resources began to deplete. Our people struggled, but we held on. Until one day, a powerful force, a threat beyond our ability to control, came to our world. They wanted to take everything, and we fought, but we could not win. Daniel's heart sank as he listened. The story she told was not one of invasion, but of survival. Her people had been driven to Earth by necessity, not greed or malice. So you didn't come here to harm us. Daniel said slowly. You came because you had no choice. Exactly, Lyra replied, her voice full of quiet sorrow. We were forced to leave our home, and we have nowhere else to go. We only seek refuge, but the moment we arrived, we were met with suspicion, fear. And now, they call me a monster. Daniel's mind raced as he processed what Lyra had said. The fear the world felt wasn't based on facts, it was based on assumptions, on labels. But it wasn't too late. There was still time to change their perception, to show humanity the truth. He had to believe that. You're not a monster, Daniel said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of his conviction. But the world needs to hear this. They need to understand the truth about you, about your people. We need to change the way they think, and I think I can help with that. Lyra looked at him, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and disbelief. You would help me? I will, Daniel replied, nodding. I'll do whatever I can to help you, Lyra. But we need to be patient. We need to take this one step at a time. And the first step is showing them who you really are. Lyra felt a wave of emotion rush over her. Gratitude, relief, and a deep sense of connection she hadn't expected. For the first time since her arrival, she felt like she had a chance to change the narrative, to make people see her not as a monster, but as a person. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her emotions. Thank you for believing in me. Daniel smiled, his eyes soft with understanding. I believe in you, Lyra, and I believe that humanity can learn to see beyond fear. It's just going to take time. For the first time in weeks, Lyra allowed herself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, Earth wasn't lost. And with Daniel's help, maybe she could show them that peace was possible. But first, she had to trust him, and she would. For now, it was enough. As they sat in the quiet room, Daniel and Lyra shared a moment of understanding, a silent agreement that they would work together. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was a start. A chance for both of them to make a difference in a world that had once turned its back on both of them. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments of shared conversation between Daniel and Lyra. At first, their interactions were carefully measured, tentative, as if both were unsure of how far they could trust each other. But as time went on, something began to change. What started as small exchanges of words soon grew into deeper conversations. Daniel began to understand more about Lyra's world, and she learned more about his. Lyra spoke about the history of her people, their peaceful ways, their pursuit of knowledge, and their deep respect for the natural world. She shared stories of her home, a planet where cities were built with harmony in mind and the skies were always clear. She told Daniel about her family, about the warmth of her parents and the laughter of her siblings before the war had come to their planet. Daniel, in return, spoke of Earth, its struggles and triumphs, its wars and its peace. He told her about the complexities of human nature, how people could be both compassionate and destructive. He explained that, despite the chaos that often surrounded them, humans still had the ability to come together, to build bridges and make a difference. What is it like to live without constant fear? Lyra asked one day, her voice soft with curiosity. Daniel thought for a moment before answering. It's not perfect, but we try. We try to build something better with each day. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we don't. But we keep trying. Lyra's eyes sparkled with something akin to hope. I wish we could have that. Peace without fear. Daniel nodded. We're still trying to figure it out ourselves, but I believe it's possible. And I believe we can help you show the world that you're not a threat. Lyra smiled, a small, hopeful curve of her lips. For the first time since arriving on Earth, she felt something more than loneliness. She felt like there might be a way forward, a path she could walk with someone who truly understood her. Their conversations became the highlight of Lyra's days. Each meeting brought new insights, new questions, and new answers. Daniel didn't just see her as an alien. He saw her as a person, someone who had suffered loss, someone who had endured hardship. He treated her with the respect and dignity she had longed for, and that was more than she had ever hoped for. But despite their growing connection, there were still challenges. The world outside the facility remained hostile. The media continued to spread misinformation about Lyra and her people. The fear of the unknown was deeply ingrained in humanity, and it was not easily shaken. The idea of peace seemed so far out of reach, especially when the majority of people still believed Lyra was a threat. Daniel knew the road ahead would be difficult. He had seen the way people reacted to her, how they called her a monster, how they feared her without understanding her. It wasn't just about changing the minds of a few people. It was about changing the entire world's perspective. It would take time, and it would take more than just words. It would take action. One afternoon, Daniel sat down with Lyra and shared an idea that had been forming in his mind. Lyra, he began, I think we need to show the world who you really are. Not just tell them, but show them. We need to give them a glimpse of the truth. Your truth. Lyra looked at him, intrigued. How? We'll start small, Daniel said. We'll find a way to connect you with the public. Maybe through interviews, maybe through a public appearance. But we'll do it in a way that shows you're not a monster. You're just you. Lyra hesitated. The idea of stepping outside, of showing herself to the world after all that had happened, made her nervous. But what if they still fear me? What if they never see me for who I truly am? Daniel placed a reassuring hand on the table between them. There will always be people who fear the unknown. But there will also be people who see the truth. When they look at you, we just have to make sure they have the chance to see it. Lyra thought about his words. It was risky, she knew, but Daniel was right. If she wanted to change the world's perception of her, she had to take that first step, no matter how difficult it was. I trust you, she said quietly, her voice filled with determination. If you believe it will work, I'll do it. Daniel smiled. I believe in you, Lyra, and I believe that the world can change if we give them the chance. In the days that followed, they began to plan. They spoke with the facility's leaders, working together to organize a controlled public appearance. It would be carefully planned, with strict security, but it would be a chance for Lyra to show herself to the world, without the fear of being attacked, without the cameras flashing as if she were a threat. The event was set for the following week, and the news outlets were notified. The world would be watching. The first steps toward change had been taken, and Lyra felt a surge of hope she hadn't felt in years. But even as she prepared for this momentous occasion, doubts lingered in her mind. Would the world really see her as she was? Or would they still view her as a monster? Daniel could see the uncertainty in her eyes. He leaned forward, looking at her with unwavering support. Whatever happens out there, just remember, this is the first step, and I'll be right there with you every step of the way. Lyra nodded, feeling a strength inside her she hadn't known she had. For the first time, she wasn't facing the world alone. Daniel was by her side, and together, they would face whatever came next. The days leading up to Lyra's public appearance were filled with preparation. Every detail had to be carefully planned. Daniel and Lyra worked together tirelessly, ensuring that everything would go smoothly. But the pressure was beginning to mount. The world outside the facility was growing more anxious, more fearful. The media buzzed with headlines, some hopeful, others filled with doubt and fear. There was no middle ground. People either saw Lyra as a chance for peace or as a threat to everything they knew. Lyra could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had come to Earth in search of safety, in search of understanding. But now it seemed as though she was carrying the responsibility of humanity's future. If this moment failed, everything she had hoped for, everything she had risked, would crumble. Daniel could see the tension in her eyes, the way she would sometimes stare out the window, lost in thought. He knew how much this meant to her. He could see how much she wanted to make the world see her for who she really was. But he also knew the risks. The world wasn't ready. There were still too many people who would never accept her, who would never see past their own fears. One evening, as the sun began to set, Daniel found Lyra sitting alone in her room, her head resting in her hands. Her posture was slumped, the weight of everything pressing down on her. He walked in quietly, his footsteps soft against the floor. "You okay?" he asked gently, sitting beside her. Lyra didn't look up at first. The silence stretched on, thick, with the weight of her emotions. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared, Daniel," she admitted. "What if they don't believe me? What if they still think I'm a monster no matter what I do? I'm not sure I can take that." Daniel felt a pang of sympathy in his chest. He knew how much courage it took for Lyra to even consider stepping outside of the safe walls of the facility. He placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer reassurance. "Lyra, you're not a monster," he said firmly. "But I get it, it's terrifying. This is a big step and you're facing a lot of fear, both theirs and your own. But you're not alone in this. I'll be right there with you." Lyra looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. But what if they don't listen? What if they only see what they want to see? Daniel took a deep breath. There will always be people who are afraid of the unknown, who are afraid of change. But you can't control what other people think. All you can do is show them who you really are. And if they still choose to fear you, that's not on you, it's on them. Her eyes softened, but the fear still lingered. What if I fail? What if everything falls apart? Daniel smiled, a gentle, reassuring smile. Then we try again, and again if we have to. The world's not going to change in a day, but that doesn't mean we give up. Lyra nodded slowly, taking in his words. "I want to believe that," she said softly. "I want to believe that there's hope." "There is," Daniel assured her. "But you have to believe it too." The day of the public appearance arrived and the tension in the air was palpable. Lyra stood in front of a large glass window, looking out at the crowd that had gathered. They were a sea of faces, some filled with curiosity, others with skepticism. The cameras were rolling, the lights blinding. It felt as though the eyes of the world were fixed on her, waiting for her to speak, to act. But in that moment, Lyra felt small, as if the weight of the entire planet was resting on her shoulders. Daniel stood beside her, his presence a quiet comfort. He didn't speak, but his steady gaze offered her the strength she needed. She turned to him, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. "You already are," Daniel replied softly. "You're here, standing, tall. That's the first step. The rest will come when you're ready." Lyra took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. She could feel the nerves in her stomach twisting and turning. But she wasn't alone anymore. She had Daniel by her side, and that was enough to give her the courage she needed to face the world. The moment came. The doors opened, and Lyra stepped into the public eye. The crowd fell silent. All eyes were on her. She felt their stares, their judgment, their fear. But she stood tall, her head held high, her heart beating loudly in her chest. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to back down now. Daniel stood by her side, his presence a quiet reassurance. As the first question was asked, Lyra spoke. I'm not here to hurt you," she said, her voice strong but calm. "I am not a monster. I am just a traveler, seeking refuge." I come from a place far from here, a place where peace once reigned. My people are not invaders. We are survivors. We only seek a chance to live, to learn, to share with you." Her words were met with silence, and then murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some faces were filled with confusion, others with disbelief. But some, just a few, seemed to soften, their eyes filled with curiosity rather than fear. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Lyra could feel the shift, however small it might have been. She wasn't a monster. She was just a person, like them. As the questions continued, Daniel remained close, offering quiet words of encouragement. He knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but he also knew that this moment, this first step, was the beginning of something important. It wasn't the end, but it was progress, and sometimes progress was enough. The world watched in silence as Lyra spoke. Her words, though soft, carried a weight that none could ignore. It wasn't a perfect start, but it was the beginning of something new, a chance to break down the walls of fear that had been built between her and humanity. The world had seen her, heard her, and for a brief moment they had been forced to listen. But despite her courage, Lyra knew that the path ahead would not be easy. The reaction had been mixed. Some people had begun to look at her differently, their expressions softening with curiosity, with understanding, but there were still others who saw her as a threat, who were unwilling to let go of their fear and hatred. The press was relentless, their cameras still trained on her every move. The headlines still screamed with skepticism, and the news reports, though slightly more open-minded, still focused on the danger she represented. Lyra could feel it, each unspoken judgment, each whispered accusation. But what struck her most was the reaction from the government. While some leaders praised her bravery, others questioned her true intentions. There were whispers of keeping her confined, of using her as leverage, and even fears of what might happen if her people decided to take action. Daniel had been by her side through it all. He had seen the way the world shifted, the way the tides of public opinion ebbed and flowed like the ocean. He knew that this was just the beginning, that Lyra's presence on Earth would continue to stir fear and suspicion for a long time. But he also knew that what mattered most now was the hope they had ignited in those few people who were willing to see beyond their fear. And then, the breaking point came. Late one night, Daniel received a call from one of his contacts in the government. The news was grim. There had been a sudden shift in policy, a decision to confine Lyra to a more secure location. They feared that, despite her peaceful intentions, her mere presence was causing unrest, and they wanted Ted to remove her from the public eye. It was a clear message. Humanity wasn't ready to accept her yet. Daniel was furious, but he knew what he had to do. He couldn't let Lyra be locked away again, unable to speak for herself. He couldn't allow the progress they had made to be undone so quickly. The next morning, he walked into the facility where Lyra was being held. Her room was quiet, the soft hum of the lights the only sound. She was standing by the window again, looking out at the world she could no longer be a part of. The weight of the decision was clear in her posture, in the way she held herself. Her shoulders slumped, her expression distant. "Daniel, what's going on?" she asked without turning to him. "Why does it feel like everything is falling apart?" Daniel sighed, walking up beside her. "They're trying to put you back in confinement," he said quietly. "They want to hide you away, keep you from the public." Lyra's shoulders stiffened and she turned to face him. "What? Why?" "They're afraid. They think that keeping you out of sight will keep the fear from spreading, but I don't agree with them. You've already done so much by standing here and telling your story." Lyra shook her head. "It's not enough. It'll never be enough." "It is enough," Daniel said firmly, his voice full of conviction, "and we're going to make it enough." For the first time since they had begun this journey, Lyra looked at him with a spark of hope in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "We're going to defy them," Daniel said, his voice steady. "We're going to show them that you are not a threat. We'll make sure the world sees who you really are, If they want to hide you away, we'll make it impossible for them. Lyra's eyes widened. But how? They have all the power. I don't have anything. I'm just one person. You're not just one person, Daniel said, taking her hand. You're the symbol of something bigger, and together we can make people listen. And so they made a plan. The next day, Daniel and Lyra made their move. With the help of a few trusted allies, they managed to send a message to the media, a message that couldn't be ignored. Lyra would hold a press conference, not behind closed doors, but in front of the world. She would make her voice heard, loud and clear. The government couldn't hide her anymore. The press conference was set in a public square, surrounded by the very people who had been watching her every move. The news cameras were there, the world's eyes focused on her. The facility's security tried to intervene, but it was too late. Daniel and Lyra had already made their stand. Lyra stood in front of the crowd, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading and hoping for. The crowd was silent, waiting for her to speak. Today, I stand before you not as a monster, she said, her voice clear and strong. I stand before you as a person just like you. I come from a world that is far from here, a world that has known pain, loss, and fear, but I have not come here to bring fear to your world. I have come to seek peace, to share knowledge, and to ask for understanding. Her words were met with silence at first. The crowd was unsure, uncertain. But then, something changed. A few people in the front began to nod, their expressions softening. More followed suit until the silence was broken by a soft murmur of approval. The shift was slow, but it was happening. And then Daniel stood beside her, his voice carrying through the microphone. What she's asking for is simple, he said. She's asking for the chance to prove that her people are not here to harm us. She's asking for the chance to build a future together. And if we can't give her that, then we will have failed ourselves. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The crowd was uncertain, but there was something in Daniel's words, something that rang true. They had heard her story, and for the first time they were truly listening. Lyra had done it. She had defied the odds, defied the fear, and shown the world who she truly was. There was still much work to be done, but this was the first victory, a victory that no one, not even the government, could take away. The world had changed in the days following Lyra's bold press conference. The media, once filled with fear and skepticism, now carried a different tone. There were still those who questioned her, who looked at her with distrust. But there were others who saw the truth in her words, the truth that she was not a monster, but a being seeking peace. And as more and more people began to listen, the shift in public opinion became undeniable. The government, too, was beginning to realize that Lyra's presence on Earth could not be ignored. Her peaceful intentions were clear, and the way the world had responded to her defiance was even clearer. They had underestimated her, thinking that fear and isolation would keep her quiet. But now, Lyra was speaking to the world in a way that no one could dismiss. She had become a symbol of resilience, of hope, and of the possibility of peace. But the road ahead was still uncertain. While some countries and leaders started to open their doors, others remained hesitant. Fear was a powerful force, and it would take time to overcome. Yet every day brought new conversations, new perspectives, and a growing sense that humanity was beginning to shift. Lyra sat in the facility's small meeting room, her gaze distant as she looked out the window. It had been days since the press conference, and she could still feel the weight of the moment, the eyes of the world upon her. She had hoped for acceptance, for understanding. But there was still so much work to be done. The path to peace wasn't going to be easy, and the fear that had been built up over years would take time to dismantle. Daniel entered the room, breaking her thoughts. He had been her constant support through all of this, always by her side, always ready to help. He smiled as he approached her, taking a seat across from her. "You look like you've been thinking about the world's problems again," Daniel said gently, his eyes filled with understanding. Lyra gave him a small smile. "It's hard not to. The world is changing, but I can feel how fragile it all is. One wrong move, and everything could fall apart. Daniel nodded, his expression serious. It's true. There's a lot of work ahead, but look at how far we've come. The world is listening now, Lyra. They're starting to see you for who you are, and that's more than we could have hoped for just a few weeks ago. Lyra's eyes softened. She had grown so much during this journey, learning to trust, to open up, and to believe in the possibility of change. But there was still a part of her that feared rejection. It was hard to let go of the weight of all the years of being misunderstood, of being feared for no reason other than her appearance. I just wish it could happen faster, Lyra said quietly. I want to see the change. I want to feel it. But I know it will take time. People are afraid. Daniel leaned forward, his voice steady. Fear is powerful, but it's also something that can be overcome. Look at how much you've done already. You've sparked a conversation that the world can't ignore. And every day, more and more people are starting to see you for who you really are. Lyra thought about his words, the truth in them sinking deep into her heart. She had come to Earth not to conquer, but to learn and to live in peace. She had not come as a monster, but as a visitor from another world, one who longed for connection, for understanding. And despite the fear that had greeted her, there were still those who saw her as she truly was, a being capable of kindness, intelligence, and empathy. There's more work to be done, but we've made progress, Daniel continued. People are starting to speak out in your favor. Some of the leaders who were against you are beginning to listen. And the people? They're beginning to see the truth. Lyra's heart lifted as she listened to him. It wasn't easy, but every day brought new hope, new allies. She wasn't alone. She never had been. I know it won't be perfect, Daniel said, his eyes meeting hers. But we're on the right path and we can't stop now. Lyra nodded, her expression filled with determination. She had come this far. She couldn't turn back now, not when there was a chance for something better, for something lasting. Thank you, Daniel, she said softly. You've been with me through all of this. You believed in me when no one else would. I won't forget that. Daniel smiled warmly. And I'll always be here for you, Lyra. We're in this together, every step of the way. The days that followed were filled with meetings, both with human leaders and public advocates. Lyra met with groups of people who had once been terrified of her. She spoke to those who had rallied against her, offering her side of the story, and showing them the truth of who she was. Slowly but surely, the walls of fear were beginning to crack. There were still challenges ahead. There were still those who couldn't let go of their fear, who refused to see the possibility of peace. But Lyra was not alone anymore. She had allies now, humans who believed in her and in the message of peace that she brought. Daniel stood by her, always ready to support her, always believing in the future they could build together. And as the days passed, Lyra began to see the change she had hoped for. It wasn't perfect, and there would be setbacks. But humanity was starting to understand. The monsters they had feared were not the aliens, but the misunderstandings and the prejudices they had built up over years. And with every conversation, with every step forward, Lyra knew that she was part of the change, part of a movement that could bring peace not just to Earth, but to the stars beyond. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a beginning. And that was enough.